Hello, I'm Harley Schlanger. Welcome to our weekly conversation with Helga Zepp-LaRouche, the founder and chairwoman of the Schiller Institute. Today is February 1st, 2023, and this Saturday we'll be holding a very important conference on the topic, The Age of Reason or the Annihilation of Humanity. Now, this is highly appropriate given that on the one hand, the buildup for war continues, especially following the decision made last week to provide more tanks for Ukraine. But at the same time, there are more voices emerging which are calling for a diplomatic solution and, in fact, broadening that to somewhat parallel, Helga, your call for establishing a new security and economic development architecture, including the meeting between President Lula of Brazil and German Chancellor Scholz. Why don't we start with that and give us your assessment of what's the importance of that meeting?
Well, Scholz clearly was traveling to Latin America, to Chile, Argentina, and Brazil with the idea to continue the campaign, to diversify, in quote, raw materials, to, get the countries of the global south on the side of the so-called democracies against Russia and China. And also swear in the leaders of the developing countries on the green agenda. And I must say, this trip was a complete flop, and it just proves that Scholz, as all the other, there are only nuances in difference, all the other leaders of the West have really lost touch with the gigantic epochal change which is going on right now in the world. When Scholz almost a year ago was talking about a change of times, he was obviously referring to turn the German economy into a militarist war economy. And he completely is missing still, obviously, to the present day, the fact that there is an epochal change, and that is that the countries of the global south are fighting against the old colonialism, and that they're not intending to, participate in the old games of the geopolitical forces of the West. Now, first of all, none of these countries, neither Argentina nor Brazil, agreed to Scholz's demand to deliver ammunition for the tanks, because the Leopard used in Brazil, for example, is just an earlier version of the Leopard 2, which is now being sent to Ukraine. But Lula refused to sell ammunition. President Fernandez from Argentina refused to do so. And Lula also refused to be part of the climate club, which he countered with another proposal, namely to propose a peace club. And he said that the countries of the global south are now all, intending to get together, or many of them, to basically offer themselves as mediator to end the war in Ukraine. He also said that when Lula will go to China in March, that he will basically talk with Xi Jinping about it and try to convince China to be part of that peace club and mediate. Now that is the time of the sense of the spirit of the time, and so all the efforts by Scholz failed, because of these disagreements. The free trade agreement between Mercosur and the EU did not come through either. So I would say, that was, I hope that Scholz has learned a lot of things.
And Helga, what Lula was talking about, this idea of a peace club, but also the rejection of the policies coming from the European Union, that somewhat reflects your discussion of the emergence of a new non-aligned movement, which is not going to take sides in this war, but is going to actually look to creating something new, isn't it?
Yes, as a matter of fact, if you look at the speech I made in the conference in Bandung in November, which was published also in a book, There I basically say that the global south, that a powerful group of nations should get together and fight for a change in the agenda to put a new security and development architecture on the table. And that's exactly what Lula is doing, and I think that that there, in my view, is the biggest hope, that together with the efforts of the Pope, which I think is still a very, very important initiative, the Pope, who has offered the venue of the Vatican for peace negotiations, all the countries who are fighting for a peaceful solution should get together. There should not be a competition among them, because between the initiative of President Lula and the Pope, and also what Erdogan is doing from Turkey, this should all be lasered into one effort to try to stop this war, because it is becoming absolutely horrible. I mean, the Ukrainians are being slaughtered. I mean, the Ukrainians are the victim of all of this, because the idea of sending more weapons there and prolong the war and have a war of attrition against Russia. Who is paying for that? Naturally, Russian soldiers, but it's the Ukrainian army, but it's especially the Ukrainian civilian population, which is dying, and this must therefore stop. And I think the first thing is to stop, to go back to diplomacy. But then, as I have said many times, if you don't address the larger picture, what is wrong with our present international order, I don't think you can solve the problem fundamentally, which is why I have proposed the new global security and development architecture and the 10 principles on which it must be based. And I can say very, happily that I get a lot of feedback, and a lot of people are starting to actually take these principles serious. Some people are making suggestions what should be added, and I'm very open for this kind of discussion. But we need principles, how to organize the world other than this geopolitical confrontation between the so-called democracies and the so-called autocracies, which is becoming absurd, because many people are now waking up to the fact that democracy in the West is going out of the window. We don't have democracy. We don't have freedom of the press. We don't have freedom of speech. If you basically say anything which is not the official narrative, you are taking the risk of being fined, or as it was now in the case of a Berlin lower court. There is a conviction of somebody who made a speech only saying that the Germans should not repeat their history, which, I mean, that should be obvious, and some judge thought that he has to be put for 40 days in jail.
Well, also joining the chorus of diplomacy and moving away from more weapons, you had an agreement between Hungary and Austria in the last day or so. The president of Croatia warned of the danger of nuclear war if this kind of buildup continues. We're seeing other voices emerge, but what we're seeing from the think tanks of the British military, and the US military is planning for more war. So as you said, Scholz doesn't seem to be getting the message yet. It certainly isn't getting through to these think tankers and war planners, is it?
Well, there is a new study by the Rand Corporation, and many people have been pointing to the fact that it was a study of the Rand Corporation from 2019, which basically had the entire scenario for the present war against Russia via Ukraine. So these studies should be taken serious, because they're, especially the Democratic administration in the United States is, I don't know if they commission these studies and then the think tank is just carrying out the order, or vice versa, if the eminence grise of the politics of in the Wall Street and other places, in the MICIMATT, as Ray McGovern calls it, the military-industrial complex, plus think tanks, plus Congress, plus media, are working on these things, and then the government carries it out. Whatever, there is this new Rand Corporation study, which says basically there should not be a prolonged war in Ukraine, and in so many words, naturally covered in whatever language. But basically the idea is, the US should not spend all of these efforts and resources on the war with Ukraine, because the real big one is coming, and that is the coming war with China. And there we had this big scandal that a general from the Air Force from the United States, Minihan or some name like that, he basically said that there will be a war with China for sure between the United States and US and China by 2025. And that was echoed by a congressman who completely supported this idea. So this idea that a conflict between the United States and China is inevitable, that is going through the ranks. We picked it up also from discussions with military in Europe, who basically are telling us that there are only two lines. One is that a prolonged war with Ukraine is not in the interest of the United States for that reason. And another line which says, no, we should have a continued long war in Ukraine, because that also helps to continuously weaken Russia and weaken China. But all factions essentially would be united that the war with China is inevitable. I think that is absolutely insanity. It is madness. And I mean, we are right now mobilizing together with many other forces around the world to stop that, because we are already in World War III. If people would listen to the nuclear experts, like Stephen Starr, who was featured on several Schiller conferences in the last period, we are one step away from an accidental nuclear war. The atomic scientists have just changed the doomsday clock to only 90 seconds to the end of civilization. And, this thing can go so absolutely wrong. And if the British have their way, who are continuously pushing a war over Crimea, and there are many people who say that, these tanks and also now the fighter jets, which are being demanded by the Zelensky government, and rockets and whatnot should all be used to attack Crimea and reconquer the Donbass. If that happens, we are in the vicinity of this thing really going out of control. And the West is completely foolish when they don't take into account the many, many times expressed security interests of the Russians. And they say, oh, no, there are no red lines. You see, we did this and we did that, and the Russians didn't respond, so there are no red lines. I think this is the biggest stupidity of all, because it is a terrible situation, and I think it's completely crazy. So we are mobilizing with this next conference on Saturday, which you all should absolutely tune in and participate. And then we are in contact with many people on both sides of the Atlantic to have large demonstrations in the United States on February 18th. In Washington, there's a big demonstration, also in London. And then 1 week later, we are in contact with many groups about demonstrations in Europe. This is also the 1-year anniversary of the beginning of the war. And therefore, all forces must be united to exert maximum pressure on the governments to stop the war.
I just want to bring up one other delusion, which is held by so many of these people who are saying the war should be extended to Crimea, we should be preparing for China. The comment that comes out quite often is that Russia will be broken from China, and that the so-called pact between them is paper thin, it's not going to hold. And if you escalate sanctions against Russia, Russia will fall, they're running out of missiles. What do you have to say about people who still cling to these delusions, especially the so-called weakness of the Russia-China relationship?
Well, I think that in both Russia and China, there are strategists who are very clear of what is the intention of the West. I mean, it has been said many times, this so-called Foreign Minister of Germany, Baerbock, I have a hard time getting used to the idea that she is actually a foreign minister, because she has as much to do with diplomacy as a cow dancing ballet on a frozen lake. This is anyway. She said it. She said the aim of all of this is to ruin Russia, and Austin said it. He said the whole purpose is to weaken Russia. And Putin and other Russians have expressed many times that they are aware of that, and that they see that the entire mobilization is coming towards them with the idea to eliminate Russia in its present form as one coherent state, divided into many parts, and basically get control over the vast resources of Russia. Now, the Russians know that, and they are the largest and most strongest nuclear power in the world. They have missile systems which are technologically superior to that of NATO, and the Chinese know that, and the Chinese is the strongest, in some senses, strongest economy, or second largest economy in other senses. And, together they are pretty, strong, I would say. But if you divide one from the other, it doesn't look so great, given the fact that NATO is going global NATO. But what we are trying to fight for is that this whole dynamic of escalation, that this is completely suicidal, and people have to wake up.
Well, a good place to start for waking up would be the conference coming up this Saturday, Schiller Institute conference. You can go register for it at the schillerinstitute.com. It's an online conference. And maybe you want to just say something briefly about what people can expect to see when this convenes on Saturday at 10 a.m. Eastern Time.
Well, you can go to the Schiller site and see actually the list of speakers, which is again quite sizable. We have a very large contingent of top politicians from Latin America, former president of Guyana, former minister of Argentina, several sitting congressmen from different countries. So the Latin American politicians are extremely concerned about world war. They don't look at Ukraine and say this is far away. So they have come forth and actually are in the forefront of trying to work together with us to form a citizens of the world movement, in the spirit of Friedrich Schiller, that everybody should be a world citizen as well as a patriot. So that Latin American component will be very strong. Then we will have a very large group of politicians and specialists from Africa, different African countries, because Africa is the continent of the future. And in order to make that clear, we have several speakers who will speak about the Belt and Road Initiative, the Chinese policy in Africa, the need for Europe to ally with that. So we will have speakers from China, from Pakistan, from Italy, from Germany, from other corners of the world, all discussing the need for European nations to work with China in the development of Africa. And there, I think it's very important that the Pope, who is just in Africa, and he was in Democratic Republic of Congo for 4 days, now he's in South Sudan, and he, absolutely has caught on this present fight by saying hands off Africa. Basically, talking against those people who only go to Africa to grab resources. And he told people, he said, look, you all, meaning the people, you are so much more precious than all the so-called raw materials of your continent, by pointing to the value of the human life as being the absolute much more important and superior. So anyway, so the Africa question will be a feature. Then we will naturally feature the need to support the initiative of the Pope. For that, we will have also many speakers, especially a whole group of clergymen from mainly the United States, but also other countries. So I think you absolutely should join this conference because we will discuss the alternative, the new world economic order, the principles of the new paradigm, and you will hear from many corners around the world people who are absolutely determined to save this beautiful humanity, because if you leave it to this oligarchical system which is in control right now, the world has no chances. So that is really the fight which is at stake.
Well, Helga, I know you're very busy pulling the conference together, so we're going to cut our program a little shorter this week. But thank you for joining us. Our viewers should share this video to build the conference for Saturday, and join us then. And Helga, I'll see you on Saturday.
I hope I see you all on Saturday.